Hello, this is Lady Boulay, and welcome back to Black American Lineage. Today we're going to talk about a little known group of Black American men who set the tone for today's elegant, classy Black American man. I'm not talking about the scrubs. I'm talking about the respectable, conscientious Black American man. I'm talking about these elegant men who worked on America's sleeping car trains from 1868 until 1971, and they were called Pullman Porters. This group of men set the tone for Black American excellence and hard work. I use these words because they're true, they were elegant, and by all historical records, they were excellent at their work, but also because we have to stop letting other people define us, because they are going to define us in the most negative terms. So if we want the narrative changed, we have to change the narrative. Pullman Porters were men hired to work for the railroads as porters on sleeping cars. Starting shortly after the American Civil War, George Pullman sought out former slaves to work on his sleeping cars. Their job was to carry passengers' baggage, shine shoes, set up and maintain the sleeping berths, and serve passengers. Pullman Porters served American railroads from the late 1860s until the Pullman Company ceased operations on December 31st, 1968, though some sleeping car porters continued working on cars operated by the railroads themselves, and beginning in 1971, Amtrak. Until the 1960s, Pullman Porters were exclusively Black and have been widely credited with contributing to the development of the Black middle class in America. Under the leadership of A. Philip Randolph, Pullman Porters formed the first all-Black union, the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, in 1925. The union was instrumental in the advancement of the civil rights movement. In addition to sleeping cars, Pullman also provided parlor cars and dining cars used by some railroads that did not operate their own. The dining cars were typically staffed with African American cooks and waiters under the supervision of a white steward. With the advent of the dining car, it was no longer possible to have the conductor and porters do double duty. A dining car required a trained staff, and depending on the train and the sophistication of the meals, a staff could consist of a dozen men. Pullman also employed African American maids on deluxe trains to care for women's needs, especially women with children. In 1926, Pullman employed about 200 maids and over 10,000 porters. Maids assisted ladies with bathing, gave manicures and dressed hair, sewed and pressed clothing, shined shoes, and helped care for children. Growing up in Alabama in the 60s, my hometown was one of those places where the sleeping car trains stopped. And those porters would come to church sometimes, and it was always a real joy and pleasure when the Pullman Porters came and worshiped with us. They were very sophisticated, very elegant, well-mannered, and even when you traveled on the train, my dad used to travel on the train, and even though he traveled in the colored section before the trains were integrated, he was still able to observe the Pullman Porters. Everybody was impressed with the behavior, the elegance, and the style of the Pullman Porters. And by the time my dad was traveling on the train, they had perfected it because they began serving on those trains in the 1860s, right after slavery. And the reason that George Pullman wanted African American men was because they had been through slavery, and he said they were used to serving the wealthy class. So in that era, for a black American man to be a Pullman Porter was a very prestigious job. While the pay was very low by the standards of the day, in that era of significant racial prejudice, being a Pullman Porter was one of the best jobs available for African American men. While this was an opportunity, at the same time, it was also an experience of being stereotyped as the servant class and having to take a lot of abuse. Well, they were going to have to take a lot of abuse no matter what kind of job they had, and they were going to have to be a servant because you have to work up from being a servant to being a master. But in the words of Jackie Robinson's wife, they had to take it. They took it. And that is how the foundation for the black middle class was built. One of the insults that they all endured was that many of the passengers called all of them George, to the point that there is a book called 10,000 Men Named George, because there were 10,000 porters and all of them were called George, as in George Pullman's servants. Porters were not paid a livable wage, and they relied on tips to earn enough to make a living. This was their way of digging their way out of poverty. They had to take this kind of job because at least it was steady. It didn't pay a lot of money, but it was steady. Walter Biggs, son of a Pullman Porter, spoke of memories of being a Pullman Porter as told to him by his father. One of the most remarkable stories he said he liked hearing about from his father was when Jackie Gleason would ride. All the porters wanted to be on that run, and the reason was that he gave every porter $100. And he said it was also fun because Jackie Gleason played the piano and they would sing and dance and have a good time. And he said Jackie Gleason also respected the job that they did. It must be emphasized that these men were not working for a lot of money. A 1926 report by the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters stated that the minimum monthly wage for a regular porter was $72.50, with the average being $78.11, and tips on average amounting to $58.15. However, porters had to pay for their own meals, lodging, uniforms, and shoe shine supplies, amounting to an average of $33.82 a month. It did not pay a livable wage, but they made a living with the tips that they got. Now, this is the part of the story that we will recognize, was aware that as former chattel slaves, the men he hired had already received the perfect training and knew just how to take care of any whim that a customer had. He was aware that there was never a question that a traveler would be embarrassed by running into one of the porters and having them remember something they had done during their trip that they did not want their wife or husband perhaps to know about. And because he was working these men very cheaply, and because they served on these luxury trains that people enjoyed because the porters catered to their every need, George Pullman made a lot of money of these men because Pullman Porter servants did not belong to the train. He was like an employment agency. He was employing these men for the trains. So he was a separate employment agency. But the trains hired these Pullman Porters because they made the train ride easier, more luxurious for the train travelers. So George Pullman went on to become the largest single employer of black people in America. And the job of Pullman Porter was, for most of the 100-year history of the Pullman Company, one of the very best a black man could aspire to in status and eventually in pay, because after they formed the union of the Brotherhood of the Sleeping Car Porters, they lobbied for more money, and they got it because they had made themselves valuable and even essential to luxury train travel. Historians have begun writing about the Pullman Porters, and one says that the Pullman Porter had the best job in the black community, but the worst job on the train. And we can see why. This train travel with these Pullman Porters went on for 103 years. But with the rise of air travel and automobiles becoming more prevalent and people traveling more by automobile, the Pullman Porter style of travel declined. But their legend still stands, and now they're being remembered. Amtrak in 2008 became aware of the Pullman Porter's National Historic Registry of African American Railroad employees and began honoring the surviving porters through a series of regional ceremonies. Amtrak also attempted to locate additional survivors in order to interview them for a promotional project, which I think is great because it would be really good for America to see how those trains were run with those Pullman Porters. And the writer says, even today, observers are struck by how elegant the elderly men are, because they're all in their 90s and 100s by now. When we find them, they are dapper. They are men, even at this age, who wear suits and ties. The legacy of the Pullman Porters is a remarkable one. They weren't superstars. They weren't the first black to do this or that. They were just men up from slavery who wanted the dignity of having work, a job that they could respect. Not that the people respected them, but that they could respect, and they were well respected in the community, and they did an outstanding job, as witnessed by the fact that the company went on for 103 years until other forms of transportation became more convenient and cost effective. I'm going to end with this video that I think you will find informative.
After the Civil War, Chicago businessman George Pullman began hiring thousands of African American men, including many formerly enslaved people, to serve white passengers traveling across the country on his company's luxury sleeping cars. The need for labor created employment opportunities for African Americans, and the first Pullman Porters began working on the trains around 1867. The men worked long hours in passenger cars that they were not allowed to travel in due to Jim Crow segregation laws. The Pullman Palace Car Company built, owned, and operated the majority of luxury rail cars. These opulent trains were dubbed hotels on wheels due to onboard social activities, dining cars, and sleeping berths. Pullman was open about his reasons for hiring black porters. He reasoned that formerly enslaved people would best anticipate and cater to his customers' needs and work long hours for cheap wages. By the 1920s, 20,224 African Americans were working as Pullman Porters and train personnel, the largest category of black labor in the United States and Canada. While they were underpaid, overworked, and endured constant racism, Pullman Porters helped fuel the Great Migration, shaped the black middle class, and laid the groundwork for the Civil Rights Movement. Their duties included carrying baggage, shining shoes, maintaining the sleeping berths, and serving meals. In some cases, they were required to perform for customers. Porters were at the beck and call of the passengers and were under constant scrutiny, expected to give service with a smile, but not so friendly that they may be accused of impropriety or disingenuous conduct. Passengers used the derogatory terms "boy," hailing from enslavement, or "George," after the founder George Pullman, instead of the porters' names, exerting power and a sense of ownership over the men. Porters endured long hours, with passengers frequently boarding and detraining at stations throughout the night. Porters were required to work 400 hours, or 11,000 miles per month, whichever came first, to receive their full salary and often relied on tips to make a decent wage. Porters could be required to work shifts up to 20 hours long to make up their 400-hour monthly minimum. They also had to pay for their food, do unpaid prep duties, and purchase their uniforms. Despite routine discrimination, Pullman Porters were well-traveled, knowledgeable, and had regular contact with politicians and other wealthy clients. They had their finger on the pulse of American society. The Porters had an alliance with 5 prominent African American newspapers and transported vital information to Black communities. The Western Appeal from St. Paul, Minnesota was one of the first newspapers to report on the Pullman Porters. It became the official publication of the United Brotherhood of Railway Porters. The Porters organized and founded the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters in 1925 with A. Philip Randolph, who advocated for improved working conditions and salaries. The BSCP was the first African American labor union to sign a collective bargaining agreement with a major corporation. The union also included Black female maids who were expected to babysit white children in addition to their cleaning duties. BSCP faced staunch opposition from the Pullman Company, and it took more than a decade for the union to sign a labor agreement. In 1937, after 12 years of resistance and negotiations, the BSCP was recognized as the official union of the Pullman Porters. Their victory helped to lay the foundation for the united efforts of Black workers and labor unions during the Civil Rights Movement.
Every time I see an engine coming down the track, I get so doggone lonesome that I wish I was back. Listen to the whistle, Lordy, Lordy, what a thrill. I wish I was in Dixie with old Steamboat Mill. I plan off different stations as we roll along the line. I press it, think the mission question, is the train on time? Is the train on time? I get the coat and hat. And see, boy, I don't know exactly where I'm at.